I'm Sarah Berry Tschinkel. I'm a Jungian analyst, and I'm also a playwright and performer. And I became interested in Sabina Spielrein when the David Cronenberg film came out, and I believe it was in 2011. I had heard about it, and it was quite controversial. His depiction of Spielrein, the relationship between Spielrein and Carl Jung, and also Sigmund Freud. And so it piqued my interest, but it also was a difficult film to watch because Spielrein was depicted as such a hysteric. And it made me wonder whether that was accurate. I did hear in my Jungian community that two analysts confronted Cronenberg at the screening and asked him to explain why there were so much creative license taken, and why he would make the choices he did that weren't really true. He did admit that a good part of the film was his imagination, and it told a good story, and it did, however spicy, salty, and inaccurate it was. But I sort of didn't think of it too much more, except it really sort of like galled me a bit, the depiction of women. But it also sort of made me really begin to track and think about how women in the psychoanalytic world were treated and what their contributions were, and the role of the female hysteric in psychoanalytic literature. A number of years later, I was approached to be a part of a team that was making a play, psychoanalysts making a play about forgotten women in psychoanalysis, or women that they thought were undervalued. And the part that they asked me to play was Marie-Louise von Franz, a Jungian analyst. And a friend of mine, Margaret Klink, could not play the part, so she offered it to me. And I read it, and I said, I'd love to play this part. I have a background in theater, but I'd like to write it myself. And so they agreed, and I wrote the part of Marie-Louise von Franz and performed in that particular play in a number of venues. Freud Museum in London, different psychoanalytic galas in New York, Smith College School for Social Work 2018 Centennial, a number of other venues. And along the way, becoming friendly with many of the other analysts in the play, in particular Louise DaCosta, who is the creative director. She became a good friend. And I mentioned to her one day that I would love to write and play the part of Sabina Spielrein. So she was having tea with Carol Siegel, who's the director of the Freud Museum in London. And Carol had just hosted an exhibition called The Women, Sigmund Freud's, I think, Untold Muses, something like that. The title was something like that. I think originally there were about 6 women in this show, and it did a bit of an overview of their contributions, their relationship to Freud. Anyway, Carol and Louise DaCosta were talking, and Carol happened to mention to Louise, maybe you and some of your colleagues should write a play about this exhibition like you did the last one. And Louise became very excited and approached me and Susan Quinn, who was one of the writers in the first play, asked us if we'd be willing to collaborate. And I said, of course. I really wanted to get to know Sabina Spielrein and to play her. So I began a deep dive into Sabina Spielrein, and I read almost everything I could find on her, papers she wrote, correspondence between Spielrein and Jung, correspondence between Spielrein and Freud, Sabina Spielrein's diaries, as much as I could, and she became more and more fascinating to me. And not only was she a significant presence in the psychoanalytic world, but so many of her ideas were pioneering insights, and she had gotten very little credit for them. Along the way, one of the things that I really became intrigued with was her relationship with what she called guardian spirit. Guardian spirit was an internal figure. She wrote about it as something that God had given her. And if you know anything about Sabina Spielrein, she had a very, very traumatic childhood. She had a very unstable family, a very violent and somewhat abusive father, a mother who had nervous agitation. While they were very well-to-do, it was quite a troubled family. And when Spielrein was 16, her younger sister died of typhoid. And that really sent Spielrein into what I think may have been a psychotic break. At the very least, it was major post-traumatic stress disorder. And what allowed her to become somewhat functional was her relationship with Guardian Spirit. Guardian Spirit was a female voice that appeared and spoke to her in German and told her over and over that she was destined to be extraordinary, that she had extraordinary gifts to bring to the world. And that internal voice, that Guardian Spirit, stayed with Spielrein for most of her life, or at least until her diaries stopped.
Can you tell me what it was like, that spirit?
From what I could gather from Spielrein's diary, it was a loving spirit. It was a very positive spirit. It was female. And it would talk to her in German. Now, what's interesting is Spielrein was Russian, but in her household, it was a very learned household, and the children were expected to speak different languages. And one day they were supposed to speak German, another day they were supposed to speak Spanish, another day they were supposed to speak Russian, another day they were supposed to speak Hebrew, yes. So she grew up in a very demanding intellectual household, and she was multilingual. So this spirit spoke to her in German. And in fact, she had quite a passionate relationship with the Germanic culture over her life. She lived in Berlin. She studied composing there. She also lived in Vienna for a while. She lived in Geneva for a while. But she really loved the Germanic culture. She loved Wagner. She loved Schiller. And so one of the stories that is written about her is that she did not believe the German atrocities when they were happening. She was living in Russia. She said, the Russians are brutal people, but I do not believe that about the Germans. And the Germans did indeed kill her and her daughters.
What was the city that she lived in?
She lived in a port town called Rostov-on-Don, and that was her home, her origin. And she tells a funny story about her family home. She says it looked like a Rococo, she said it was a Rococo mansion, and that her friends and people in town called it sugar cake because it was a grand cake-like structure.
And when you say the Germans killed her, can you tell me the story around that particular issue?
Well, it's unfortunately a very long and tragic story, but in a shortened version, Spielrein married and returned to Russia at the urging of her family. Her marriage was an unhappy one. So she took her young daughter, Renata, and she lived for about 10 years around Europe. And then as the climate was becoming more and more difficult in Europe, her family urged her to come home to Russia, and she did. When she returned not long after, the environment became extremely hostile to Jews and to intellectuals.
Because of the Germans?
Because of the Russians. Stalin, yeah. Stalin began to crack down on Jews and on intellectuals. And being a practicing psychoanalyst was no longer safe. And so she could not find any work. And then her husband was conscripted into the army, and so she had to take all sorts of menial jobs. Meanwhile, she had a second daughter with her husband, Pavel. And she was no longer a practicing psychoanalyst, but was working, I think, in nursery schools and various other places just trying to make ends meet. Then Pavel died of a massive heart attack, and so she was really on her own with two little girls. About that time, the Russians and the Germans invaded Russia, and she began to hear all sorts of rumors about the Germans. And people told her as a Jew she should, run, escape, but she did not believe them. She kept defending the Germans and saying they would not do these things. The Russians are the true animals, not the Germans. But the Russians, in fact, rounded up, I think, over 20,000 Jews over the course of a 2-week period and shot them in a ravine outside of the town of Rostov-on-Don.
So it was the Russians who killed them?
No, it was the Germans. The Russians may have rounded them up, but the Germans marched into Rostov-on-Don.
I see. And so she lived in Germany for how long and where and for what reason?
She lived all over Europe. She lived for a brief period of time in Berlin. She lived in Berlin, I think, several times. The first time around, she was a young woman and she did not have Renata, and she wanted to study music and composing. The second time around, she was looking for a psychoanalytic home, and she could never find one. She lived in Geneva, she lived in Vienna, she lived in Berlin. I think there were a few other places, but she was treated with suspicion, and for several reasons. One, because she was a woman. Two, because of her notoriety being involved with Carl Jung, and Carl Jung at that time was persona non grata. So anyone who had a relationship with Carl Jung was also persona non grata. And then her psychiatric history, which I haven't mentioned, but Jung and Spielrein met when Spielrein was at the Bergolzi. She was 19 years old when she was hospitalized at the Bergolzi for psychiatric difficulties. She was, in fact, quite disturbed.
What is the Bergolzi again?
The Bergolzi was a premier psychoanalytic institute, and it was run by a man named Eugene Bleuler. And Bleuler was renowned for being an extremely kind and compassionate man. And he really believed that his staff should treat people with kindness and compassion and be genuinely interested in them.
Was this her first contact with psychoanalysis?
This was early psychoanalysis. In fact, Jung did the talking cure with Spielrein, and she was Jung's first talking cure patient. Unfortunately, maybe fortunately, unfortunately, Spielrein and Jung fell in love. Certainly Spielrein fell in love with Jung, and it became quite a complicated relationship. But Spielrein did credit Jung with curing her. She said his interest in her, his kindness, his involving her in his own psychoanalytic research, encouraging her to go to medical school, which she did, and become a psychiatrist herself, which she did, and then on to become a psychoanalyst. That was all because Jung encouraged her.
So he was a major teacher and influencer.
Teacher, mentor, influencer, and from what we can gather, lover.
Now, I understand that she also studied with Freud at one point. And how was that? Was that a complicated choice for her?
Well, it was complicated, yes, very complicated. She didn't necessarily study with him, but she went to Vienna. She wrote to Freud first from Zurich, where she was in medical school. And she let him know that she was in a very complicated relationship with Jung. And Freud was not interested in hearing about it, and he did not believe her version. He wrote back that he knew Jung to be an upstanding man, and that basically Spielrein just needed to get over any infatuation she had. Later it came to light because Spielrein enclosed a letter that Jung had written to her mother, basically telling her mother that he...
A letter to Freud?
No, Jung wrote a letter to Spielrein's mother because the Spielreins heard through the grapevine, an anonymous source, that Spielrein and Jung were involved romantically. So the parents approached Carl Jung, and Carl Jung wrote them back that he did not want to have anything more to do with Spielrein, that he did not want to gratify her wishes, and that he had never gotten paid for treating her anyway. Anyway, Spielrein was terribly hurt and enraged by the letter that he wrote to her mother. So she enclosed a copy of that to Freud with her own letter. And Freud confronted Jung, and Jung admitted that he had been involved with Spielrein. And that, in part, led to the rupture between Freud and Jung.
I see. And that is sort of a taboo in psychoanalysis? Or is that a complicated question to ask at this point?
Are you talking about a taboo to be involved with one's patient? Absolutely.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. That's always been a taboo. It was a taboo then. It's a taboo now, even more so. Now we have very clear guidelines and laws about it. But then it was a young field.
I see.
And there wasn't as much known about it, and there certainly wasn't as much known about the transference, counter-transference relationship.
I see. You did not like the film because why?
Well, first of all, it did not at all mention, or if it did very, very briefly, Spielrein's contributions. And they were many. She studied the infant mind. She came up with the concept of destruction and creation being kind of a correlated principle. She wrote about the mother-in-law, the origin of language and consciousness. She wrote about so many topics that she did not get any credit for. In the film, she was depicted as this almost nymphomaniac and certainly involved in a sadomasochistic relationship with Jung. There's no evidence of a sadomasochistic relationship with Jung.
And now it described her as being sort of irrational and crazy, as it were, right? In the film.
And she was disturbed when she first was hospitalized at the Bergolzi. I mean, one of the first things she did was she tore her room up, she poured lemonade all over it, and she attacked her nurse. She was very distraught. And the Bergolzi was the third hospital that her uncle Adolf had taken her to. And the other two told the family that she was too disturbed for them to work with her. But she did land at the Bergolzi, thankfully, and they treated her very, very kindly.
How old was she at that time?
She was 19 years old.
Wow.
She was 19.
And tell me a little bit about Jung and his apparently his marriage. He was married at that time, so he broke not only the patient-client relationships, but also he was married at that time. And how did that all work out?
I don't want to get into a moral thing. He was married. He was married. He was married to Emma Jung, who seems to be, by all accounts, a wonderful human being. She was obviously very patient and very forgiving because Jung was quite adored by many women. Jung, in fact, surrounded himself with women. Freud surrounded himself primarily with men. Jung surrounded himself primarily with women, and they were all gifted and intellectually curious and mostly in love with Jung. And Spielrein was one of them. And that must have been awfully hard on his wife.
How about Freud? Now you say he surrounded himself with men. How do you see that, and why is that the case?
Well, Freud was 20 years older than Jung, so that's one thing. He was from a different generation. But Jung also had a fascination with women. He believed that part of the difficulties or the troubles in our world were because we had lost our way, we had lost the balance of the masculine and feminine principle. He believed that masculine principles and feminine principles needed to coexist side by side in order to have a balanced world. So by masculine, and again, he did break it down along gender terms. That was logos. What he thought of logos is the rational mind, intellectual curiosity and pursuits. He defined the feminine as more intuitive, the more creative, the more emotional side, but he believed that the balance had gotten seriously out of whack. And so he was fascinated by women and fascinated by what they brought to consciousness within him. There has been a bit of a renaissance around Spielrein. It probably started maybe before Cronenberg's film, but there are a number of scholars who began to really be very curious about her. And a number of her papers were found in Geneva. She had done most of her important papers while she was in Geneva. And by the way, Ernest Jones, who was a follower of Sigmund Freud, had written his colleagues in Geneva prior to her arrival, telling them that she was not to be trusted. And he did that because of her relationship with Carl Jung and also because of her psychiatric history and because she was a woman. But Freud intervened and told the colleagues, the Freudian colleagues, treat her with kindness, treat her with gentleness. But she never found a community there. But she did write, I believe, 19 of some of her most important papers within a 3-year span when she was in Geneva. She left those papers in the care of someone, and they were found in a basement probably 40, 50 years later. And so that kind of contributed to a real renaissance of her life and her ideas. And an Italian named Cara Tenuto wrote a book about her, and that started a whole number of other psychoanalysts unearthing her papers, researching her, trying to find members of the Spielrein household who might have survived the Nazi purge, and really tracking down, I think they found a niece in Russia, and really trying to track down her body of work. There are many, many missing papers, but a number of scholars have put together a bit of a chronology of her ideas.
And why is that happening?
I think because there's more of an acknowledgement of women who were contributing to early psychoanalysis that never got credit. And she was a major one. Mm-hmm. There are many others, but she was certainly a major one. She was basically erased from history. And now people are coming back and kind of really detailing when she presented her ideas and how they influenced others, and really making her the pivotal figure that she was, the pioneering spirit that she was.
What made you particularly interested in her?
I think what I loved about her was her chutzpah. She was just remarkable. And I think so much of it may have had to do with guardian spirit, this internal figure that appeared to her early in life. But, I mean, she had this affair with Jung. She went on to medical school. She contacted Freud. She went to Vienna at the age of 26, knowing no one. She presented herself to the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. She asked to speak, and she presented her papers there. She was 26 years old. And this was this bastion of elderly, upstanding men, and there she was. And I just loved that about her. She just seemed undaunted by her troubles and by her gender and by the era. She plowed ahead. I love that.
Are you a little bit like her?
I wish I were more like her. She's a role model. I think she's a role model for many.